etc., what they amount to. But the fact is the protests started almost immediately. So they have been underway from end September. It is just that the Delhi media or the Indian mainstream media takes notes of protests or things when they happen closer to Delhi, and then the international media picks up. But the protests in Punjab started at the end of September. They were pretty extensive.
Sorry, just stop you 1 second. I just want to make a note that this is all on background for our members. And if you want something on the record, you can contact our panelists after we're done. But I just want to say this is all on background for right now. Anyway, go ahead.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I usually just say what I'm saying in private and public. It's easier that way. So it saves us a lot of trouble. So September is when the protests had started. And September, pretty extensive in Punjab. And it was 2.5 months of protests in Punjab before the protesters moved to the outskirts of Delhi. And the real attention in terms of the media started when they'd reached the outskirts of Delhi in large numbers. But the protests were as extensive and widespread in Punjab for 2.5 months. The Punjabi media was reporting it. And there was some reportage in the Indian media, but at that time, all the efforts that we are seeing of the Indian government was to show that these were protesters trying to cut off the northern part of the country, Ladakh, where the troops were stationed fighting against China, from the rest of India by blocking rail traffic. I mean, so this was sort of a precursor to the kind of language that is being used about the protests now after. So when they moved to the outskirts of Delhi is when the real attention started on the protests. And that's also been now almost, I think it must be nearing 2 months or a little over that. The protests escalated purely simply because the government had 9 or 10 rounds of talks after the protesters reached the outskirts of Delhi. But the talks, there has been no real progress because the government has really not given way. They've realized that the protests have a lot of force behind them. The protesters from Punjab have been joined by protesters from Haryana and from Western UP. It's still true, and we must remember that these protests are largely drawn from one farming caste in North India, whether they are Sikh or Hindu. It's largely a Jat or Jat protest as of now, with some Gujars and some people from Rajasthan. And now it is beginning to get support from various other parts of India, but the bulk of protesters come from just this area and form the driving force behind the protests. As long as it was predominantly Sikh, the government tried to play various cards, which it has been doing over a period of time, that these are separatists, Sikh separatists, Khalistanis who are inspiring it. There was drama on Republic Day when there was a parade, a counter parade to the official Indian Republic Day parade, which celebrates the Constitution. The farmers marched through Delhi. It involved hundreds of thousands of farmers passing through Delhi. There is a contrast. We must remember this, that no private property was damaged. No citizen in Delhi who was not in uniform was hurt or harmed. There was that one incident at the Red Fort, which was highlighted, where they barged in. There were clashes with police, and the Nishan Sahib, which is a Sikh flag at every Gurdwara, was put up, but without removing the tricolor, despite all that has been said since then. But that was the sum total of what supposedly went wrong. The Red Fort, we must also remember, is not Capitol Hill. It is not India's Parliament building. It is a monument that is today being run by a private corporate called the Dalmias, basically. So in that sense, it does not even represent something that the government stands for in any real sense. It has symbolic value on that particular day. Since then, because of government propaganda, there was danger that the protests could dissipate or would begin to focus entirely on Sikhs. But something happened on the western side of UP. As the protests were coming to an end in that area, I think there was an attempt to disrupt Rakesh Tikait, one of the Jat leaders, Hindu Jat leaders. He's the son of Mahendra Singh Tikait, again a farm leader whose sort of involvement in these issues goes back to 1 or 2 generations, to the 1980s. the Sikh history of farm protests. The Jats is much older, but I think we'll come back to that. Right now, there's a deadlock with the Supreme Court having stayed the implementation of these laws. And that is what the government has on the table for the protesters, that we will stay these laws for 18 months. This is the best offer. Post the events of 26 January, there have been no more talks, but the protests have actually gathered force in the meantime. This is the current situation. The government has tried to do many things, including cut off internet, have a mob attack the protesters with the abetment of the police, which is sort of a replay of what we'd seen in Delhi during the anti-CAA protests as well, where again, Hindu fundamentalist mobs, we've documented this, with the abetment of the police, actually attacked the protesters. And the legal system today is actually persecuting or prosecuting basically the people who were victims in that violence. So some of those things are being repeated right now. That's the current situation.
And Ravinder, maybe you can talk a little bit about the Modi government's role in all of this and their history with what's going on with farmers and passing laws of this nature.
So I think perhaps I'm going to, like what we need to speak about is that why the protests have continued to expand and why the usual playbook of the government to kill the protests has not worked. And I think to answer this question, perhaps we must also look at the, the bigger transformations which are taking place on ground. And namely, one thing is that the whole idea of market reforms does not seem to have a, enchantment anymore. Because since 1990s, Indian government has undertaken a series of reforms. And of course, what Congress did was very different from BJP, which we can talk about later. But for the BJP government, especially as Hartosh has also pointed out, that many of these laws were undertaken as a matter of urgency during the pandemic, while the parliament has otherwise been shut down, but on emergency measures, it wasn't just farm laws which were passed, it was also actually the labor code which was changed. So entire notion to make India into a factory of the world kind of model, that has been pushed. And if you pay attention to the rhetoric, the protesters are consistently speaking about, that they are against particular corporations or the whole idea that companies will take over. And on the other hand, the government has been consistently speaking about a different language of, parasites, or, yesterday we heard a new word called Andolanjeevi and whatnot. So what you can see is that there is a distinction, the whole market model here is not working. And why, India at this moment is, it has historic inequality on one hand, unemployment is very high, and the whole idea that wealth will eventually trickle down, that has actually not happened, which basically means that farmers, it is not just farmers with, who are landed peasantry who are part of this protest, but also landless peasants. They're also workers. It's actually the whole social base of this protest has become very large. So why these continue to fail? I think another reason we must remember is that it is almost like a kind of playbook, or if I might say, it is like a toolkit, the BJP's toolkit, which almost everyone seems to know that this is what will happen. So when, for example, recently we had that, some locals, local groups who went and tried to cause violence, I think almost immediately everyone understood that this was not the case. And as I think Caravan, reportage also showed that, these were BJP cadre who were dressed up as locals and who had gone to foment violence. And I think this is why Mandeep Punia, one of the journalists who was arrested, because he had actually shown to us what everybody has kind of suspected. So I think in this sense, there are multiple reasons that I'm laying out to you for you. One, that the BJP playbook is known to everyone, and everyone is almost ready to counter that. On the other hand, what is allowing the disaffection which is on the ground, namely the fear of economic dispossession, that has found popular resonance across board. So therefore, one must remember that these are just not the landed peasantry, and I might mention here that the constant rhetoric that these are rich farmers is so wrong, because 85% of farming community in India is marginal and small farmers, and literally we are speaking about 1 to 2 acres of land. And the incomes, when you compare to the city, urban and rural incomes are so divergent that to think about these people as rich farmers is part of the propaganda. So, and I think this, the rising inequality and the resonance these protests have found among so many must be kept in mind.
I'll just pick up there and sort of echo what Ravinder and Hartosh have given us and add.
And if you can talk a little bit more about maybe being in New York, like what foreign reporters like us should be covering, and kind of maybe what we can focus on in terms of what the farmers are going through and what this all means for us.
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to speak to that. I would say, there is a part of what Ravinder Benji is describing here is that there's a different sort of resonance that we typically see. The toolkit, which has been so effective even in recent years around propaganda calling anyone who opposed the Citizenship Amendment Act an anti-national, anyone who opposed the disruption in Kashmir an anti-national, right? This is a true and tested practice for the BJP and the Indian government in general, and it's not working. And I think part of the reason is the international perspective is very different in this case. Part of it, I think, Ravinder, you're right, that there is on the ground level, there's a disenchantment and a disillusionment with the promise of change. I think that's true. And I think also if we look at, and both of you have alluded to this, but we should say it explicitly, the agrarian issue is not a new issue. It's decades long, and the farmers are now, the water is depleted, they're in debt, the epidemic of farmer suicides, we all know this, and they're now at a point where their backs are against the wall. They have no other option but to push back, and I think that's when we see movements like this happen historically. Now what I'll say is part of what feels different to me sitting in New York is that the attention and the pressure on human rights is very different in this case. And Hartosh, you started alluding to this, and I'll just sort of build up to that right now. I think, at least in my lifetime, India, for the most part, has gotten a free pass when it comes to human rights violations, typically because it's seen as a strategic ally, a counterbalance to Chinese imperialism, a counterbalance to quote unquote Islamic terrorism out of Pakistan. And so the world is typically, in the US in particular, has turned a blind eye. And what we are seeing now is a slew of human rights violations that are being picked up and amplified, partially because of the availability of social media, but it's not just that, right? It's partially it's the pressure of global icons like Rihanna and Greta Thunberg, but it's not just that either. It's a collection of different issues that are coming up and putting enough pressure that we are seeing across the US, across North America, within Europe, and all over. Political leaders of different ranks are making statements, and that's different. I want to speak to a few things that are coming up as key points of resonance in Western media. We typically would not pay attention to something like the detention of Mandeep Punia, right? That's not a story that usually gets picked up in Western media. Even if you think about all the other journalists who have been detained, those stories are not as prominent as his, and so that's something significant. The same is true for the detention and sexual assault of Dalit woman labor activist Nodeep Kaur, who is still in detention and has been denied bail for a third time. So I think those are some stories that seem to be landing. I think in part because the conditions here in the U.S. have changed. The appetite, or at least the tolerance for anti-democratic practices in the wake of Trump, I think, has really changed conditions and has put more urgency behind stepping up. The other thing I would say is what's really seems to be resonating within Western media and Western circles is the quelling of free speech. And that's press censorship, as we've discussed, internet shutdowns, as we've discussed, and also the anti-national propaganda. I think what we are seeing is a shift in consciousness, but at the same time, not necessarily a shift in media coverage. And let me tell you what I mean by that. From what I am seeing, a lot of media coverage in the West is still relying on popular framing from the Indian nationalist side to shape the nature of the interaction, to really describe what's going on. And there's a really interesting article that just came out in a site called Baz News, which refers to the ways in which headlines have been written around the world, particularly in the US, from major outlets that buy into the Indian nationalist framing of the issues. And so I think what we ought to be careful of as journalists, as we're entering into these conversations, is to really take the lessons we've learned from the Trump era and to think about these ideas of false equivalence or platforming or inappropriate platforming, perhaps, is a better way to say it. But I think those are the kinds of things that are both relevant for us to be considering and also resonant in terms of what our audiences might be wanting.
And speaking of that perspective on American media, Hartosh and Ravinder, since you're outside of the States and you're obviously consuming a lot of different media, what do you think? I mean, most of us work for American outlets or Canadian outlets. If you can maybe talk a little bit about how the story is being framed from your perspective and what you would maybe like to see get covered or like to see get talked about a little bit more because it's part of the bigger story.
The 2-3 things that I want to, and I mean, I think even in what we've spoken so far, we haven't touched upon them, that there is a history of Indian agriculture to these protests. They haven't come out of anywhere. The second is the laws themselves. What do they mean? Why is it a problem? Because there is a narrative in the Western media which tends to look at everything from the lens of whether it is a step in the right direction in terms of opening up the markets, liberalization, etc. The problem with the laws are actually also to do with the specifics of the laws, and I'll come to that. It's not simply a question of whether you oppose opening up the markets or not opening up the markets. It's far more complicated than that. But just the history of the protests, because that is something that even in India is not well understood. The protests are at the moment basically still rooted in 2 of the northern states, Punjab, Haryana, and Western UP, a small part of that. Together, these states, the land area that we are talking about is less than 2 to 3% of India's land area. So is the population less than 2 to 3%. For that very reason, we must understand that at the moment, this is not a political challenge to the Narendra Modi government. It is not threatening his hold over the country or the Hindu nationalist framework under which he's operating. We must understand that. And we must not make the mistake. Part of the reason he can prolong this negotiation and go on is because his political base is intact. It so far has not been challenged or threatened by what is going on. So why is this 2% of the population up in arms? This 2% of the population actually produces almost 50% of India's surplus food grain. We are talking of purely just wheat and paddy. Paddy is rice. And this is a particular reason for why this has happened, good historical reason. When the British expanded to the Punjab, that was in the 1850s, they, for the first time, opened up new canals. Punjab has 5 rivers. Those canals opened up vast areas in parts of Punjab which are now in Pakistan. These areas became the first sort of the commercial production of food grains in India dates back from this region to the 1880s, 1890s. And the first farm protests, fed by the same peasantry, first began in 1907 when the British challenged ownership laws in this area. It was the same peasantry, I'm not sure what background I can presume, but one of the most famous figures in the Indian independence movement, Bhagat Singh's uncle, was the driving force behind these protests. And they lasted for a year and a half. So people who are worrying about how long can these protests last, in Punjab, there have been a series of agrarian protests starting from 1907, 1930, 1920, 1935. Later, most of these protests have had the legs to sustain themselves for a period well over a year, year and a half, 2 years. So the 3, 4, 5, 6 months of these protests are not enough to tire the farmers out or to ensure that the protests would die away just because Modi will wait them out. The reason this area is seeing this surplus of agriculture is simply because, unlike the rest of the Indo-Gangetic plain, this is an area where the farmers till the land themselves, own the land themselves. This is not tenancy farming. So these farmers were quick to adopt new technologies, new methods, and this area has been producing for the market for the last 100, 120 years. When post-independence, India became a grain deficit region, this was the area that the country turned to and invested in to produce its surplus of food grains. For that very reason, the government's machinery of procuring grains is most established in these 2 states. The new laws through the back door, and this is not evident to most people when they, is proposing to decommission this machinery by setting up a parallel structure of private procurement of grain, backing the large corporates. The laws do not even allow legal recourse in terms of disputes with private players. So the people who stand most to lose are farmers from these 2 areas. And this decommissioning is what they are opposed to. This is where the largest surplus of India's food grain is produced. It has given the farmers some security. And since the question of suicides often come up, in Punjab itself, 80% of the farm suicides happen outside the region where paddy is grown. So Punjab grows cotton and paddy. In cotton, there is no government procurement machinery. So the farmers know exactly what will happen when the government machinery collapses. The situation of the paddy and the wheat areas will become like the cotton area. The cotton area is less than 15% of Punjab. It is from where 80% of the suicides are reported. So clearly the absence of a government procurement machinery is something they've witnessed, what it does to farmers, what it exposes them to, the pressures. These are available firsthand to farmers there. This is roughly what is driving the protest. This is the situation right now. In this context, it is necessary to understand this background. The problems that the farmers are dealing with, the Green Revolution, which basically fed India. These are the regions which have fed India for the past 50 years and have ensured that as the population has more than doubled, the supply of food grain has been enough to ensure that the country doesn't go hungry. Post-independence, led by the Americans, many of the Western democracies had used food aid to actually exert pressure on India's foreign policy. It was in response to this that these areas were turned into sort of granaries of India. This area never produced paddy because it doesn't have the rainfall. The production of paddy has seeped away groundwater. It has damaged the soil. That is again something that private players entering Punjab will not be able to sort out. This area actually now requires greater government intervention to sort out the problems it is facing. So many of the reasons why the farmers are out there have to do with the very intervention of the Indian state that is now trying to remove itself from this place. So you are actually now seeing a protest which has very strong legs, strong support, and the ability to sustain itself for a long time, and a government which is in no political danger, led by a man who has enormous ego, because if he were to concede on these laws, again, he will not lose anything politically, but he has defined himself as somebody who cannot be seen as losing face. So we are in a deadlocked situation at the moment. There doesn't seem to be any immediate easy way out of this.
Thanks. And Ravinder, you had some.
Yes, perhaps I think I just want to point to two things, that when people speak about market reforms, I think it is understood very differently in India than in many other parts of the world. Because for example, I'm sitting in Denmark. This is a market economy too, but it has a very, very strong distribution aspect to it, which makes it, altogether different model. And similarly, even a country like the mecca of capitalism, namely USA, where you are, even that has a social security program. Now, in India, market reforms have taken a very, very different kind of turn. And in surprising ways, it somehow has melded into some sort of old conservative approach to economy, namely where you just wash your hands off the difficult situations, like poverty, or what do you do with the underclass, of the nation. So I think market reforms, it seems like, for example, the recent statement made by the US State Department, it mentioned that generally we support market reforms, which in India was interpreted immediately by the press as support for the farm laws. So I think I just want to say that people hear very different things. They don't understand that in India, the nature of neoliberal reforms and the outcomes are quite different. In India, basically, it means that the state is erasing itself out. That's one thing. And the other thing is that the reason that this region, Punjab and then Haryana, have seen so much, like they became the center of these protests, is that they have over the years developed a mandi system, a whole distributive network, which has not existed in other parts of India. So like some economists would say that, look, these people are fighting for something that they have, but others don't understand because they have never had it. And one must also point out that this region has a very strong tradition of trade union politics as well. And, most of these concessions that we are looking at, they have been earned by consistent fighting by the trade unions. Hartosh mentioned Bhagat Singh, and actually one must mention that Punjab actually has had a very progressive activist politics for a very long time, which people don't recognize. Because if you see Punjab only through Bollywood, then you would not realize that there is an altogether different political culture which exists. So a lot of people have been surprised that how come that protests have worked out in a very solidaric way, almost. There is some automated system which continues, so people are trying to understand the political culture, which basically begs the question that you have to understand the politics of this region. And of course, 19th century, reforms or the canal colony movement, they are very central to the creation of this economy. So I think it would be very wonderful if the journalists who are covering these aspects, they would also focus on the ways in which the entire question of market, it has a very, very different form in India than in many other parts of the world.
Thank you so much. We do have a few questions from our members. Salil is asking if someone on the panel can explain what exactly the reforms are. And the three key questions, for example, is the minimum support price going to be removed? The government claims it will remain. Are farmers not going to be able to use courts? Government claims they will continue to be able to do so. And 2 business groups are named as likely beneficiaries. But one of the groups, Reliance, says it's not intending to enter the business. But Reliance does have like a retail grocery business. And if you're familiar with that company, I mean, they kind of have their hands in everything in India. And so are those 2 leading business groups serious about entering the business? And I think maybe
anyone should I just so first to come to as far as the suspicions of these 2 groups, let's just talk about what is the evidence on the ground. The Adani group, which is has over the last 20 years, the Adani group has grown as Modi has grown. The better Modi's political fortunes, the better the fortunes of the Adani group in terms of capitalization and the debt it can raise from the market. In 2002, when Modi comes to power, the Adani group is unknown among India's large groups. In these 18 years, it has made the journey to being one of the top 2 or 3 groups in India. It has a huge presence in Australia, where it is caught up in the same issues of mining, large corporates, investments, manipulating of democratic mandates. In this context, the Adani group started investing in food storage almost 10 to 15 years back, acquiring huge plots of land, but it's only in the past 1 or 2 years has their storage infrastructure become visible on the ground. And that storage infrastructure is huge. So tomorrow, if these laws were to be implemented, which would be the first private player with the ability to move in and to capitalize? It doesn't need any conspiracy theory to say that it would be the Adani group. As far as the role of the Reliance group that comes in, forget what they are saying. The Reliance group is one of the biggest, apart from owning every other sector, it is one of the biggest investors in media. It controls 2 to 3 of the mainstream channels. It controls India's biggest think tank, ORF. That means that these institutions and these think tanks do not have independence. So please do not be misled into thinking that the ORF, the Reliance Foundation is the equivalent of an American think tank, or in America, the Indian Reliance owned channel is the equivalent of what an American channel is. Some of the most virulent propaganda targeting and denigrating the protests is being put out by these channels. Some of the most, the argument borders on sophistry in terms of what the laws mean or don't mean is coming out of the economists based at ORF who claim independence, but this is a think tank which has never dared to go against a single position that Reliance has taken in the market. So when you combine these facts, it's pretty evident in terms of what corporate interests are being represented and who stands to gain. This is just from the evidence around us. This is not some great conspiracy theory that we are talking about. So this was the question related to this. I think the other question was, if I'm not mistaken, about what the laws represent in some senses. Yes. What MSP means, etc. Again, I'm sorry if I have to go back when, as I said, the Green Revolution started in the 60s. This area did not produce paddy. It was literally addicted to paddy by the government ensuring procurement of a crop that was never grown in Punjab. A machinery was set up, a system was set up, a crop cycle was introduced that gave better returns through government investment than any other alternative. It also provided a security system, a safety net, which did not exist for any other crop. And that system was set up through the minimum support price. What the government does is across the country, it announces minimum support prices for 18 or 20 crops in it. the only 2 crops, or maybe 2.5, but that doesn't matter, 2 crops in which the government actually goes and buys is wheat and paddy. These are the only 2 crops for which the MSP has real meaning, because the announcement of a minimum support price does not mean anything. There is no legal ramification to the MSP. Traders can buy at much below MSP without suffering any consequences. But because the government intervenes to buy wheat and paddy at certain rates, in these states, the prices that farmers get does not fall below the MSP. In states where the government's procurement regime does not exist, farmers are selling paddy and wheat at rates which are 400 or 500 rupees per 100 kgs less than what farmers in Punjab are getting, or in Haryana. This does not mean that these farmers are profiting inappropriately, because through the 50 years of the MSP, in the bulk of the years, I can't be sure of the figures, but I'd say at least in 90% of the years, the MSP at which the farmers sell, and they cannot sell directly to any outside market, there's been no free market, is actually been well below international prices of these food grains. So in some senses, through this system, the Indian government not only has fed its population, it has also got food grains cheaper than if there was actually a free market existing in the country. So it is not as if these farmers have benefited disproportionately, quite the contrary. So what the government now is proposing to do is to let private players directly buy from these mandi systems that Ravinder was just speaking from, but do it parallelly without paying the taxes which sustain the current existing infrastructure. If some farmers, as farmers fear, over a period of 2 to 3 years, move away from the government system, because private players, as they have in a few other states, offer better prices in the first 2 or 3 years, farmers will tend to move out. The existing infrastructure crumbles. The private players become monopolies in the states, and then have the ability not only to dictate prices, but also to decide what farmers can grow or not grow. The contracts between farmers and the corporates, as I said, already the law has said that if there are disputes in these contracts, you cannot go to court to appeal on these issues. So even the courts have been closed off to the farmers. If the farmers are saying that there is an apprehension that the small farm, again, this question of rich farmers, the farmers which are supposedly rich in this region are richer than farmers in much of the country, but they would be people who would qualify as lower middle class in any Indian urban setting. I'm talking of the best of the farmers. I'm not talking of maybe 1 or 2% of the rich farmers. The bulk of the farmers would qualify as lower middle class in the rest of the country in urban areas. So this is the context in which the protests is happening.
Sorry, we had a question from a member about that, Marianne. She's wondering if, speaking of like this, you know, they are rich farmers compared to other farmers, but obviously not compared to the general population. But for other farmers outside of that region, especially in Kerala, like, does this affect them as well? You know, sorry, what was she asking? Where like paddy is the main crop in Kerala. I mean, are other states' crops also going to be affected by this, do you think?
Look, the question is not whether it is the main crop or not. The question is whether the state produces a surplus. So you can have a state with a large production of paddy, which may be consumed by the farmers themselves. So the market itself or the selling of paddy does not come into it. What has happened in this period of 50 to 60 or 70 years that Punjab and Haryana have supplied the country's paddy restrictions, other states have finally started developing their agriculture, and procurement centers are being put in some of these places, which is why you are also seeing incipient protests in some of these states, which have not become as large as Punjab or Haryana, but the realization that this could impact other states as well is there. But it is at nowhere near the level that it is happening here. So the procurement centers have moved in. They moved in very slowly. And now the fear is that this is no longer going to happen. It will be through private players that the bulk of purchases happen. I think the Americans have themselves seen this process happen of as large corporates entered the agriculture sector. The breakdown of family farms or small farms into large structures and an immigration from rural or farmland to the cities. But in India, that is not a real possibility. India has not set up an economy, even in the dream of the free market years, that you would displace these farmers and send them to the cities. Over 40 to 50% of India's population is dependent on agriculture. If you were to change it into corporate agriculture, there is no job, there is no economy that will be able to pick up this slack. More to the point, through this whole pandemic, over the last 6 to 8 months, when the Indian economy collapsed in some virtual senses, the only reason the country was able to sustain itself was because agriculture took up the whole surplus of people fleeing the cities, going back to the villages, living with families and surviving. So in a real sense, the government wants to displace farmers, send them to cities, to jobs that don't exist, and to conditions which are far worse than they experience. But the truth of the matter is, when the country was actually in a crisis, it happened the other way around. There was an exodus from the cities, and it was this farmer agriculture sector which actually soaked up this huge surplus and kept them alive through this period.
Thank you. I want to move away from the specifics of the laws just for 1 minute, because I think some people will write a different angle to that story. So Samir has a good question, and I think Simran, this might be perfect for you to answer from your perspective. So he says, even with the geographic and religious diversity of the protests that the speakers have explained, to what extent are we to understand this as a Sikh or Punjabi protest? And because he's wondering if there's a sense that people, especially in the diaspora, and from what Ravinder was saying, also like this Bollywood understanding of Punjab and the culture, we don't share these identities and don't see themselves as having a stake in this. Of course, that doesn't mean they shouldn't be supported or that they're unimportant, but he's wondering how much that factors into it, especially when Punjabi and other North Indian cultures have been so dominant in the diasporic narratives of the Desi identity.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I would take this in the classic professorial way of responding and saying yes to both. It is a Punjabi Sikh protest in its origins, in its impulse, as we've sort of just been describing where it comes from and why and how it really ties to understand it. You really have to understand both the history of Punjab and the politics of Punjab. And so yes, it is a Punjabi Sikh movement, and also it is more than a Punjabi Sikh movement. And I think that's where these narratives get complex. And that's where it becomes our job to be able to show the nuances of the complexity of the movement. Because what ends up happening otherwise is that most people want to say yes or no. Either it is a Punjabi Sikh movement and we have nothing to do with it. There is a potential for, separatist or anti-nationalist sentiment. There is all this history of violence in Punjab over the past few decades. Like, we don't want to touch that. And then the narrative gets turned. It gets prejudiced. And so that's very dangerous. And the other danger is to remove the historical and the contextual background of what's actually driving this movement, right? If we are to say this is an everyone movement, in an Andolan movement, right? This is for everyone, no matter where you come from. I mean, it is, and it has become that. It is inclusive in that sense, but there's more to it than that. And so I think the careful balance we have to strike is to recognize those two things at the same time. Now, what I'll say here also is, I saw this comment from Amritpal, which I think is really important, to recognize the ties that people have to their land, because this gets into the question of diaspora. On the ground, we've been describing it in the diaspora. It's a very similar sort of dynamic that we're seeing, where we are seeing people mixed backgrounds from South Asia coming forward, not just Punjab, not just India, right? Not just northern South Asia, it's all over that are coming into this. But at the same time, a majority of the efforts are being led by the Punjabi Sikh diaspora, right? And part of that speaks to the sort of narrative dominance that you referred to, Samir, that Punjabis and Sikhs, North Indians typically are seen as the sort of primary form of Indian, right? For better or for worse, and probably for worse, I think. But at the same time, the reality is, as I've been involved in a lot of these conversations and organizing, a lot of it is being driven, especially here in North America, by the Punjabi Sikh community. And I'll say a few things there. Over the past 2 months, and this might be relevant for those interested in reporting on diasporic elements, there have been solidarity protests in at least 16 different states in the US and Washington, DC. Thousands have been involved in getting their Congress members involved. Congressman John Garamendi, Jim Costa, Sheila Jackson from Texas, Robert Menendez, Judy Chu, they've all sent letters to Indian Ambassador Taranjit Sandhu, which is a significant step. And other members of Congress have reached out to the former Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo. Some have spoken on the House floor about this issue, and we've seen even more coming out of Canada, where we have Punjabi Sikhs and more South Asian representation at the federal level. And so all of this, I think, is to say that there is a complicated answer to that question, which is, yes, it's driven by and initiated by Punjabi Sikhs, but it is very intentionally seen as an intersectional movement, right? This is not about Punjabi Sikhs. This is about Indian farmers. And then it becomes about issues of equality. Then it becomes issues around Hindutva. And then it becomes an issue about human rights. And I think this is the last point I just want to raise quickly. For a community that has been traumatized now twice significantly by communalist violence, right? First in 1947 with partition, and again in 1984. I think there is in the Sikh psyche, the Punjabi psyche, there is a clear understanding of what could happen if things go in the wrong direction. And I think that is where I'm seeing the urgency around the activism, both in the homeland and in the diaspora.
Thanks so much. And, speaking of human rights, because I think that's how a lot of us will end up framing these stories that we do. In foreign outlets, it often gets framed as that. And this may be a good question for Ravinder. And it comes from Prerna, who is our SAJA advisor, in case anyone recognizes her name. So is this also a question of access to food? How do these laws impact consumption and future prices for consumers in India and as well as throughout the world? Where, obviously India is a producer as well. And the public distribution system still feeds a huge marginalized population. And it seems to mirror what happened in healthcare and education, which privatized and not reformed current systems, leading to this increased out-of-pocket costs and decline of public systems that worked in favor of the poor and the middle class. And we obviously see that being mirrored in the States as well. Our healthcare system is complicated, to say the least. But we see this happening with distance learning during the pandemic. Our education system the public education system has sort of failed the poor in terms of that, because they don't have internet access or reliable internet access. So this is something that we could mirror in our stories as well. But if Ravinder, can you answer that question, please?
Yes, I think what I would say is that we have to remember that who precisely is the political constituency of Mr. Modi or BJP. So I would say there are two constituencies. One is that everyone knows, which is Hindutva, which is the core vote bank, the core base of BJP. And the other, which was added in the recent years, is the economic right. People who believe in free markets, but they still value human rights and, like liberal rights. Now, these two things have combined, which brought Mr. Modi to power, and which is what you can see that there is this whole urban constituency. This is coming to the food prices and inflation, which is a very important matter for the government to maintain all the time. That, what do you do between urban and rural backgrounds, right? Now, a lot of people think that in order to have high output or high growth, you need huge input as well. But as we have seen, that industrial capitalism or industrial farming can produce a lot of food, but it can also dispossess and have, leave people out of employment or, have less distribution. And this is actually the American story also, where more and more small and marginalized farmers, marginal farmers, they continued to opt out. And in order to make, agriculture like output efficient, they would continue expanding and they would be bigger players. So which means that food production or high output, high growth continues taking place, but there are fewer actors involved. There are bigger players who come into being, right? So I think this is where I want to point out that Mr. Modi is working for that particular constituency, that alliance, which for many people, I think it took a very long while to understand that how come, Hindutva, which is often seen as, very, tradition or like, something to do with the past, right? And then all of a sudden you have this very posh kind of think tank kind of thing where people go to World Economic Forum in Davos and they speak the policy language. When do these two things combine? So this is what we are seeing over here, that these two hardcore constituencies are, running the show. And surprisingly, more you witness, what farmers, and laborers on the ground are saying, it's mind-boggling. They fully understand this. They are literally saying, but look, we will be dispossessed. These will become efficient, high-producing, bigger farmlands for sure, but we will be workers working on poor wages on these farms. So that entire cycle of growth of that it's not like you're going to run out of food, because we know that these days you even have vertical farming, leave alone farming on land, but you also have vertical farming. And you can also do it in so many methods, in so many ways. Here the question is, what is going to happen to that surplus population? Like all those people. And by the way, one interesting thing you notice is that Indian policymakers, they love talking about the fourth industrial revolution or automation, and it is as if they are completely blind to the fact that India has a very, very large workforce which needs to be employed. So I think here I'm just trying to say that on one hand, we have these very specific regional focus, Punjab, that we have been speaking about, and there are good historical reasons, political reasons we have discussed. On the other hand, there is this wider shifts which are taking place in India, which somehow have made this moment pretty rife, for this kind of disaffection. What has surprised me as somebody who does contemporary Indian history is, wow, that it has been so long, as Hartosh has also mentioned. The first actually protest started erupting in Punjab already in summertime, in June. It has been several months. And the surprising thing is they continue to expand. And every trick has failed so far, and which is something that for a lot of us who do analysis is like, wow, mind-boggling. So I think there I would like to pinpoint to the larger transformations taking place, and at the same time, the immediate causes, and also I might say that Mr. Modi must be the only one of the few politicians on earth who has had such a long honeymoon, that there is this, he's in his second term, soon second year of second term. And I think by now, for the first time, I have begun hearing that people are so openly critical, making jokes and, voicing their disaffection so openly.
And speaking of this, if you can explain that honeymoon a little bit better, and Hartosh, this might be a good question for you as well. It comes from Rebecca. What did you mean when you said these protests aren't actually challenging Modi? I mean, it seems to be from our perspective, but is there something that we're missing in that narrative, that they want to challenge the law, but not him? Or is there some other nuance to that?
So just one or two things which may add to what the previous speakers have said, and I'll come to your question, which is to do with, I think we'd spoken about the Green Revolution, surplus production, and there were some questions about the public distribution system. How does this tie up with the supply of food grains to the rest of the country? How does this tie up with the population of this country which doesn't get fed? And yes, so the Green Revolution, or the production of surplus grains, happened in conjunction with a system of food distribution through the government to people below certain economic levels. And this is the system that actually still feeds a large part of the country. What India has managed is barely to keep pace with its population. Per capita grain availability in India is still the same as it was in the late 60s. In 60 years, we have not been able to provide more grain to people. This is happening at the same time as a huge amount of surplus food grain procured from these very farmers is going waste in government storage. Look at the contradiction here. This food is going waste. The farmers are getting blamed that they are actually producing too much. The government doesn't need it. People are not getting more food grains. The problem is that the supply side of providing grains to this population has been very inefficient. That is the part that has been caught up with corruption. That is the part through which large amounts of grain are siphoned off and people are making money. If the government had actually spent as much effort cleaning up that part, rather than worrying about amending the farm laws, you could almost increase per capita food grain availability by 30 to 40% for a lot of the population without tampering with the production of food grains at this point of time. But that is something that would affect the government's coffers, that would affect the bureaucracy's coffers, that would affect a whole chain down the line. And so as a result, the country continues to be underfed. This is not a problem that will get sorted out by large corporates stepping in. This is not where they are going to divert their food grains. So this system very much is necessary, because without this, availability of food grain will not be possible for the rest of the population. So now, but this is the linkage that unfortunately people in the rest of the country have not understood when they talk about farmers' protests. Which is why I say the challenge to Mr. Modi still is not very strong politically from these laws, because his core base is largely the Indo-Gangetic Plain, Gujarat and Maharashtra. He is unaffected in these areas. This second term, the first term saw all these tendencies, but the second term is a magnification of every aspect of Hindu nationalism. We've seen changes in Kashmir, we've seen a massive Ram temple, we've seen new citizenship laws. Every move is a move for the greater sort of movement from whatever was the idea of a secular India to an idea that is Hindu majoritarian in its existence. And we must understand, when people ask, what are the other aspects of the farm protest? That part of the reason that there is such a strong opposition from Punjab is also tied to these cultural issues. The Sikh minority, like every other minority, including the Muslims and Christians, stand outside this project of Hindu majoritarianism, which actually, in the conceptual world that Mr. Modi lives in, which is this right-wing ideology, is a huge problem. Because as long as Muslims and Christians stand outside, this is actually what this ideology was designed on, that faiths from outside India are faiths who can exist in India only as second-class citizens. But the Sikhs were always supposed to be on the side of Hindu nationalism. They were seen as, in their view, the sword arm of the Hindus, a major participant in the idea of Hindu India against the Muslims and Christians. So the very visible Sikh presence in these protests challenges Mr. Modi's Hindu narrative in an ideological sense completely. which is why this attempt to tarnish it with separatism. It is a dangerous game, as Simran said, because for the first time, Sikh separatism was most strongly opposed by the Sikhs themselves. There is no thrust for Sikh separatism among the Sikhs themselves ever. Yet the very people who were the country's strongest opposition to Sikh separatism are today being branded by the label. The left movement, which is today controlling the farm protests, there is a huge Sikh ethos, but the leadership is drawn from the left, were the strongest opponents to the militant movement in Punjab. They actually took up guns against the movement. Whatever the effectiveness of this opposition, they come from actually a stream that opposed every attempt to segregate or separate India. These are the people today being labeled with the sense of separatism. But in the rest of the country,
I want to have Simran weigh in on that as well. You know, do you see it the same way, and how does that translate to the diaspora as well?
I would say Hartosh has a better sense of what's happening on the ground and the relationships there. I think in the diaspora, I would say from what I'm seeing, it's a bit more messy than that, in the sense that there are, let me say it this way, in the diaspora, there's less to lose, so it's easier to be critical. And so what I have seen is that the diaspora has been more critical, has been more openly critical, but has been drawing from the trauma of those experiences that I was describing before. So it is really interesting that, you know, what Hartosh is saying here is that in this particular movement on the ground, while the government has attempted to paint these farmers as separatists, the farmers themselves have not embraced that idea. And they've sort of, in a way, taken the approach of saying, no, we are engaged in these protests because we care about India, not because we want to break from India. And that is a very different type of engagement that you've seen from the left historically in India, across different communities and across different geographies within India. And so I think there is something really interesting about what Hartosh is identifying here, in terms of another reason, in addition to what Ravinder mentioned before, another reason why these propaganda tactics are falling flat.
Thank you so much. I do want to leave extra time for this last question. It's a lot of people have been asking about, you know, these protests have been going on since last summer, as you were saying, and obviously it's just now picking up speed in the West in terms of media coverage. Or I mean, it was before, to be honest, Reed. And we don't want to forget all the journalists who were covering it for months before then. But we have a lot of questions about the future of this. What happens to Punjabi farmers? What happens to the women who are involved in these protests? Are things going to change for them? Is it too early to talk about this, even though it's been several months? And you know, is there a chance that these laws are going to be phased in over a decade or more? Sorry, ignore that. And are they, you know, is there a chance that this is more of a long-term solution rather than something that happens overnight? And if I could hear from each of you, that would be great.
Okay, Maithili, would you like us to say something?
Yeah, if you can talk about the future of what happens to these farmers, and we have a lot of questions about that, and the women involved, and you know, are these laws going to be, like, I guess, implemented over a long period of time? Is that a feasible solution to this?
I think, first of all, we must remember that movements have a life of their own. They may begin from somewhere and they may end somewhere, and they keep on evolving along the way. And we can already see that there is this center from where it originated, but it has continued to spread and it has continued to make more and more alliances, and actually unlikely alliances. We have often overlooked there is actually a strong effort to build cross-caste alliances also among the landless laborers. I think a lot of people had in the beginning dismissed these protests because they made the classic, Marxist analysis that there is no class interest, common class interest between the landless and the landed, so this is going to fail. And what we saw was the opposite thing happening, that solidarity was not the prerequisite to start this protest, but it did become an opportunity to build new solidarities. And that's pretty important. The similar thing which is happening is that, of course, Punjabi and Sikh traditions and political culture is very much at the forefront and is anchoring this protest. But equally so, it has moved forward to build bridges, with Hindu Jats, for example. Rakesh Tiket is a good example. And if you look at all the footage which has emerged, many people are saying that, look, we are tired of this Hindu-Muslim kind of conflict, that we would like to speak about the farmers' interests. And some people are openly regretting that they actually fell for it, because some of the regions we are speaking about in Western Uttar Pradesh, Muzaffarnagar, for example, this is the region where in 2013 anti-Muslim violence took place. And some of the leaders were, whether reluctantly or openly, involved, but there is an active effort to go away from that rhetoric. And people are speaking about secular values, they're speaking about equitable distribution. What I'm trying to say is that there is a very different kind of language which is emerging from this protest. So Hartosh is absolutely right that Mr. Modi is under no threat, politically speaking, and by politically we mean that until 2024, he's absolutely secure because he has 303 seats in the parliament, right? And then there is this core constituency which exists. I must also mention that there is this economic liberal right which exists. People who are only disaffected because growth rates have fallen. The moment growth rates pick up, then everything will be fine. This is where I think someone else asked the question about factory of the world model. Why growth, or why many of these laws have been passed in the dark of the pandemic, is to, first of all, go high up on the ease of business index, for example, and at the same time, if possible, to produce high growth, because this will keep the other part of the constituency very happy, right? So I think in this sense, no one knows what will happen, because all these are living things. There are so many people. It's an organic protest evolving. But one thing there are two things I think we can already safely say. Number one, that the sheen or the magic of Modi's invincibility has cracked. Number two, I mean, you can just see all the footage, all the speeches, the conciliatory measures. And I think Hartosh has pointed, and also Simran, the Sikh question is a very difficult one in this, because Sikhs have always been, in the RSS mythology, Sikhs are Hindus, and which is an old conflict. In 1891, there was a text produced called Hum Hindu Nahi, we are not Hindus, so it's an old thing. But anyways, those fractures keep coming up. The number two thing is that the protesters, I do not see any way that they are going to pull up their tents and go back. So basically what we are heading towards is either it is a long stalemate, or I do not see any, this part pulling out. So I think in this sense, we are set for a long-term struggle and with unclear results. The only thing I would be very watchful, and as someone who is, from Delhi and grown up in Delhi, like part of the rhetoric has been, has reminded me of 1980s, which was a very, very terrible and violent decade for many of us. And I think that would be one tragic thing that nobody would want to get back into, which is why I think many people with great amount of responsibility and sensibility have kept away from even responding to these kind of very unfair allegations. As others have pointed out, Sikh separatism never has had a huge constituency. Especially I can say that as someone who's grown up in Delhi.
Hartosh, maybe you can talk a little bit about your perspective on the future of these protests, being there and being on the ground, and especially for journalists covering it. What happens now? I mean, people have been arrested, Caravan has been censored. What happens going forward? Because obviously we need you to keep telling the story.
So, I mean, clearly, we've had Modi clamping down on the media ever since he came to power in 2014. But that was the first term. Let's say those controls were more through ownership, through financial pressures. In the last year and a half in Modi's second term, which is tied up with the rise of Hindu nationalism, the clampdown has been much more severe. What was happening in Kashmir, which is more or less now colonized by India rather than as an organic territory of India, is being brought to the center. We've had in the past year and a half, a journalist attacked by Hindu nationalist mobs, beaten up by the police. And right now, in the course of this, one of our contributors arrested by the police for reporting on the protest and exposing how the ruling government was attempting to subvert it. We've had a Twitter handle taken down. We've had cases filed against our owners and editors. There was a Supreme Court hearing today. Arrests have been held off for 2 weeks, but the cases have been filed under sedition for what the government claims is a difference in how they see what happened on the ground as we reported it. This is a clear attempt. The one thing that is happening outside the larger political framework is that for the first time, Narendra Modi is losing control of the narrative, both outside the country and within the country. And he's coming down hard on whoever challenges the narrative. He wants one story coming out. It's not happening. That's also the larger story of these protests, that Mr. Modi is not in control of the narrative. That hurts him greatly. He's not used to it at all. So short term, politically, there are two things that are happening. We must understand these protests, that it is not as if the leadership of these protests is in a position to negotiate settlement and take it back to the people who've come here. These are people who've stepped forward from the protesters. They are not leading in the sense that they can make them accept a compromise. The people have come with certain expectations. They are unlikely to go back with anything short of that. In that, Modi is going to deal with the two protesters, the Sikh protesters from Punjab, differently. They've, from 2000 onwards, been opposed to Modi's electoral politics. Modi's government, BJP, has made no inroads in Punjab, and the Hindu Jat protesters, even though these are allied castes with very similar occupations, because the religious difference means that the Hindu Jat opposition has him worried for the simple reason that it extends to the state of Uttar Pradesh, which is India's largest state. It's going to elections the next year. It's a state where there are 4 parties in the fray, and a difference of 1 to 2% can mean a change in government. The Jats of Western UP moving away from Narendra Modi are the one real political challenge. To lose UP is to start worrying about your control over the rest of the country. So this 1 or 2% of the vote affects the fortunes of a state which is the largest state in the country. So I think you will see Mr. Modi trying to break up this protest into 2 parts and try and placate the Hindu Jats with measures that, while may not be acceptable to the farm union leaders from Punjab, may settle the protest. That is going to be his strategy. Whether that works or not depends on the cohesion between the leadership of the Hindu Jats and the Sikh Jats. Going forward, as to the future of these farm laws, look, one must understand what is happening with agriculture in India. It already is, when people talk of opening up agriculture, in the West, when you open things up, there is no crop insurance, there is no credit supply to farmers. The subsidy that farmers in India receive is far lower than the subsidy in any Western free market democracy. Already, the farmers are dealing with an environment which is loaded against them without any kind of infrastructural support. So the laws in the current form are hugely damaging for farmers until and unless that these laws are brought in with the kind of social structure support that exists in the West, which includes greater subsidy for farms, needs crop insurance, other interventions, but the government doesn't want to take those steps and move in from the laws. So without that, these laws are never going to be acceptable, whether it's 10 years, 20 years, or 30 years.
Thank you so much. And Simran, if you can close us out, because we're running a little bit low on time. We've obviously seen these protests for the past year about just basic human rights all over the world, right? That's what these farmers' protests are about. They want the basic right to live and feed themselves and be able to do their jobs and have their life. And we've seen that in the States too with Black Lives Matter. If you can maybe talk about how these two are similar, or you know, we've often talked about the future of Black Lives Matter's protests and how it's equally as nebulous as what we're talking about here with the farmers' protests.
Yeah, it's a great connection and a really interesting connection. You know, for many reasons it works, and many reasons it doesn't. But one of the reasons that this connection works is that now, within the last year, we have seen two of the largest global protest movements of our lifetime. Right? There's the farmers' protest and there's Black Lives Matter, and that they're both happening within the same year. Makes us ask the question of why and how is it happening right now? What are the conditions? And I think part of the conditions are the rise of ethno-nationalism globally. There is a push against white nationalism here in the States under Trump. Right? People were disillusioned, disenfranchised, very upset, and very frustrated with how things were getting worse and not getting better. Right? It's not that these issues didn't exist here in the States before. Anti-Black racism has always been a part of this country, just in the same way that agrarian depression and repression has long been a problem within the South Asian context generally. But I think part of the conditions are a real desire to push back against right-wing ideologies, and this feeling of a collective feeling of marginalization that spans across identity communities that says, hey, you know what? This is not getting better for us. It's not getting better for you. The only way out of this mess is if we come together. And I think that's what we're starting to see. It's part of what Ravinder was pointing us to when she said, you know, this anti-nationalist propaganda, the toolkit, it's not working this time, and it's because things have changed. So I think that's one big thing for us to note. I think the second is, and this is a story, I think, the role of tech within all of this, right? Like I think it's cliche to say at this point, social media is an important tool for organizing, but there are really interesting conversations within how tech is playing a role. You know, every evening now I'm on Clubhouse listening to organizers from around the country talk about what their plans are, what the issues are, educating people or creating advocacy moves. You know, where there was a big push against Facebook. That's a tech story. The relationship between Zuckerberg and Modi, that's a tech story. WhatsApp, you know, that's been huge in the South Asian diaspora. And all of a sudden everyone's moving to Signal, right? That's another story. So all of these things, I think, really speak to the conditions, and each of them creates an opportunity for a point of connection, right? For a story. And I think that's where we can start being more creative as journalists. Whatever your beat is, whatever you cover, there is an angle into this that's really interesting. And more importantly, it's untouched, right? Like there has been relatively little coverage in the West. Most of the coverage has been, generally speaking, at least, most of the coverage has been a primer, you know, what's happening and why. It's very introductory, but all of these angles, I think, are really interesting for us. So just to give you an example, I pitched a piece to Time this week and said, let's do something on human rights and free speech. And they said, yeah, we haven't done that. And then I pitched another piece to Teen Vogue and said, let's do a piece on women activists on the ground. And they said, yeah. So like just my experience has been, and this is not always the case, editors are hungry for this. They're looking at all of the global discussion around the farmers' protests and wondering why they don't have anything. And so there's a real opportunity to plug yourselves in and just say, whatever your angle is, whatever you're interested in, it doesn't have to be something so deep as a dive. It could be just whatever draws your attention, because chances are nobody's covered it yet. And I think that's a great opportunity for journalists.
Okay, we're just about out of time, but thank you so much to our panelists. I want to, thank you for being on Zoom in the evening and afternoon your time, and thank you to Simran in New York. And I hope that this was helpful for everybody, all our members, in order to hopefully write more nuanced, more stories about the farmers' protests that are beyond just the basics. And we want South Asians telling this South Asian story to the world. So hopefully this was helpful for everyone. I will send out a list of links and resources to everyone who attended and who registered for the event as well. And I'll put the panelists' Twitter handles in the chat. And if they are okay with it, if they could share their emails or contact information with everyone in the chat, that would be wonderful. But thank you for attending, and have a great rest of the day. And also, if you do write about these farmers' protests, please send me the links once they're published, and I'll share it in the weekly newsletter as well. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Maithili.
Yeah. And there we go.
Thanks again, and Hartosh, great seeing you. Yeah. I don't know. I think he's left already.
Oh, I think he left already. Yeah, it's kind of late there. So.
Sorry, I didn't want to butt in. Yeah.
Yeah.